Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this very special event with the novelist Hilary Mantel as we celebrate and mark the publication in paperback of the conclusion of her amazing trilogy, the Wolf Hall Trilogy, with the final instalment, The Mirror and the Light. Some of you will have perhaps been with us in London physically when we were in conversation 13 months ago when the book was first published. Obviously, an awful lot has changed since then, but I know that Hilary has been working away on other projects, some of them adjacent to the Wolf Hall Trilogy, and we'll be talking about those this evening. We have some very special guests joining us tonight by video, but we also want to hear from you, of course, as ever. We've got some of your questions in advance, but we'd like you to ask questions throughout, and we'll come to as many as we possibly can later in the evening. Just use the Q&A button on the right. And you also have the ability to like other people's questions, so that in that way, if you see somebody asking a question that you'd like to ask, we know that it's something that a lot of people want to know the answer to. Well, of course, it's really special to be joined by Hilary, one of the most extraordinary novelists of her generation. Hello, Hilary. Welcome.
Hello, Alex.
Isn't it so strange to be talking about the book again after an extraordinary year?
Yes, it just squeaked out. We just got published before the world folded in on itself and everything seemed to go dark. And I'm so glad we had that one event at the South Bank where we spoke 13 months ago now. And so we did feel as if the book was out there. But then, of course, the bookshops were closing and the whole relation between the reader and the writer became, well, shall I say, a lot more intimate?
Yes, that's right. It's been a very different kind of experience publishing books. I know that you have done several events like this, but then you've had a fairly kind of long period of not having to do that, and now you're starting again. What have you been up to in the meantime? I know quite a lot of it has been, as I mentioned in the introduction, sort of Wolf Hall adjacent. You've been working.
Yes,
the conclusion of the
yes.
trilogy in print is not its conclusion, is it?
No, people say to me, well, will you be sorry to say goodbye to Thomas Cromwell? But I really can't see the day when I will, because there's the play, there's the TV version to come along at a later date. In the last 12 months, I've been working on the stage adaptation with Ben Miles in collaboration. And we hope that later this year, we hope the show will be able to open. I've also been working on a book of photographs, again in collaboration, called the Wolf Hall Picture Book.
That is something that I think everybody will be, not everyone will know about that. And it's an ingenious thing. Just tell us a bit about what that project is.
For 7 years now, Ben Miles, who played Cromwell on stage in the earlier two plays and also read the audiobooks, Ben has been taking pictures, and so has his brother George, who is a photographer by profession. And the brothers started this project before we ever met and showed me their early pictures. And I thought, there's something really special here. What happened was that Ben walked the course of Thomas Cromwell's life from where he was born, approximately in Wimbledon, through to Tower Hill. And then he took pictures along the way. There were diversions, and the project grew. And we will go together to famous tourist sites, but we wouldn't take heritage pictures. It's a sort of anti-heritage project. We'd see what was there now. We were interested in the friction of the past rubbing up against the present. It was a different way of looking and a great refreshment to me. I've learned such a lot from it. So our difficulty is we go along to some amazing place like Hampton Court, and we can't get out of the car park because we're fascinated by the litter bin or something like that. We're interested in the dustbins of history and the drain pipes and the conduits of history, the electrical wiring of history, all the bits that historic sites try to hide from you. We want to show them. And it's about a sense of place. The photographs are unpeopled, almost entirely unpeopled. And they have a haunting quality, but they're also funny. So what we're trying to do is, we've got very many pictures at the moment. We have to cut down the numbers. We're matching them to text from the trilogy, though in some places it's actually text that didn't make it through into the book. All the things that were my outtakes, they've come in very handy for the photograph book because they're primarily visual or they're poetic. They're the stuff you pare away in your final edit, but they seem to resonate with the pictures. This has been difficult to pursue during lockdown. It was lucky we had got the pictures already, so it was a question of working on text and selection, and I've written an essay to go with them. So that, plus writing a play, not as we thought in a room together, because we imagined sitting there, you be Henry, I'll be Cromwell, we'll talk it. But it wasn't like that at all. The whole thing has been done by email, basically. We had, I think, one face-to-face meeting in the course of the year and a bit of Zoom, etc. But we've got there. We've got a coherent play. It works. And, you know, it's surprising what you can do when you're up against it. And we were, you know, it's lucky that we'd worked together before. I can hear Ben's voice in my head as I'm writing, and somehow we scrambled through it. So exciting times, really. And this is, it all feels as if the project, the whole Thomas Cromwell thing, it's still in process.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about that collaboration and the ways in which it's found a way to continue, even as you say, through lockdown, where different ways of working have had to insinuate themselves and develop. I mean, you've talked before about how the experience of taking the books to the stage and also the experience of TV were immensely important to the gestation of the later books. After you'd written Wolf Hall, it actually changed the way you thought about writing to an extent. I mean, it's really noticeable, the way that you've continued to work on things and change lots of things as you've written. How does that feel looking back on it at the end of this long project?
I think that everything I've written, right from the beginning, from when I began writing in the 70s, it was always straining away to get off the page and into some other form. And I was always conscious that this is how you do it for the cinema. This is how you do it for the stage, but this is how you do it for the page. And behind every scene that you actually commit to paper, there's endless potential. So working in these other forms has allowed some of that potential to escape. And also, I think what's happened is that it's fed back into my writing practice. It's energized me, and in a very practical way as well, because, you know, in the third book, the material is immensely complex. And I would often think to myself, okay, how does this look? How would you set this scene up if you were putting this scene on the stage? Where are you going to position your people? And what does that say about their relationship and their status and how they move during the scene relative to each other? So I would see it. And then I'd say to myself, okay, this is the stuff of 500-page tomes and 1 million scholarly articles. But you've got 3 lines of dialogue. So how are you going to cut through to the core? And even if that was only an exercise, it was very good for me. And also, I think, with the photograph book, it's all about quality of attention and about learning to look. And you can, as a writer, you can really forget that. For many years, my focal length has been computer screen, or it's been all my life looking at a book, not looking at the horizon. And I've actually got this sort of scholar's stoop, with one shoulder higher than the other, from a lifetime of sort of left elbow on the desk and head on hand. And I've got this uneven body now. Okay, so time I got my head up. And I stopped looking at the page and started looking at the world. Once you do that, it can't help but feed back into your writing in a productive way.
Hilary, let's go back to the genesis of the trilogy. I recall many years ago, we took a flight together because we were on an Arts Council trip. And at the beginning of this quite long flight, you said, I'm going to not pay any attention to anyone. Don't think I'm rude, but I'm just working on the notes for a new project. It's about Henry VIII. And that was that. And you sat beavering away, and we didn't really talk about it much of the rest of the trip. What did you think then was going to happen? You didn't think it was going to be this, did you?
I didn't know it was going to be 3 books at that time. I remember I was obsessed with William Tyndale at that time and the smuggling of manuscripts and the clandestine writings and the evangelical undercurrents creeping into England. So if all I said was it's about Henry VIII, then I was being exceptionally close and secretive. I think I had a pretty good idea where I was going with Wolf Hall by that time. And that trip of ours, you'll remember it was really hard, wasn't it? All sorts of things went wrong, right from Heathrow. And we ended up in with no baggage and me with no lecture notes and really desperate to hold the whole thing together. And yet I was in 2 places, and it actually carried me through that trip with a big grin on my face, or maybe a private grin, because part of me was with the book and I was thinking, this is really going to work. This is going to work. And
you knew then that this was not something that you get halfway through and think not working.
To be honest, I think I knew from the first half page. There was that feeling of, oh, at last I arrive. This is the work I was meant to be doing. This is what I've been preparing for. And perhaps because I thought of it as just one book, I wasn't overawed at that point. Looking back, I should have been. I should have been questioning my stamina, though not my commitment. But I was always in tune with the project from those first lines. It was almost like Well, suppose there's some music going on all the time, the music of the spheres, but you never hear it. And then one day you tune into it. And it felt like that to me, that I got the tone right from the off. And the music of any book is very important. Once you've really heard it, you don't lose it, I think, even though there may be horrendous complications and delays along the way, but it's always there for you in the background.
Hilary, just to be really clear, at the point where you embarked on this project, you had published several novels of all sorts, so a range of kind of styles and subject matters, but they included historical novel like a Place of Greater Safety, which of course was the first novel you wrote, although not the first that was published. And just before Wolf Hall, Beyond Black, which is a novel so beloved of so many people. I don't think that you're in any way, when you say you felt this new project was something that you'd meant to be doing, that you're sort of disparaging or distancing or disowning those earlier books, are you? But they are of a different time, a different part of your working life.
I value them all, and not just as training exercises, but timing matters very much, I think, with novels and with a writer's career. I had the idea for the Thomas Cromwell book or books many, many years ago, way back in the 70s. But I knew I wasn't ready to write it then. And then you get another kind of problem because you are on a circuit, as it were. You write, you publish, you write, you publish. I always had wonderful readers, and I had a good press. Critically, my books were well received, but they weren't selling very many. And I didn't feel I could say to my publisher, I'm going away for 5 years, write a huge historical novel about Thomas Cromwell. No, not Oliver, Thomas. I mean, it sounds so unlikely. And so Beyond Black did change things because it sold relatively well. And I felt that on the back of that, I could say, I'll be back, but it will take time. And it was the right moment. Do you know what it was like? In my book, Flood, there are some statues which are taken out of a church by the command of the bishop, and they're buried. And then later in the novel, the people dig them up and the statues have changed. And my project was like that. I put it away in the 1970s and dug it up in 2005. And it was transformed and we were ready to go. Instead of being an inert set of facts, it was something in action, in process.
Hilary, of course, that was all going on for you. You then faced the task of making this something that we, the readers, could come to. And that seems a good point to bring in one of our first special questioners. And it is Dermot McCulloch, who I think you have had many, many conversations with, a historian and biographer of Thomas Cromwell.
Yes.
Hello, Hilary. What do you consider that the readers of your novels would find most difficult to grasp about the world of Thomas Cromwell? Is there a way of helping them through that?
I think there are two ways of grasping, intellectual grasping and imaginative grasping. I think possibly it's the religious element. The fact that all the people I'm writing about were people of faith. Now, that's not to say that some of my readers aren't people of faith, but this is a much more secular society. And even people who are believers don't quite live it or live through the implications of faith in the way the Tudors did. You have people whose lives are short and they are precarious. And unless an illness is self-limiting, it's unlikely really to be cured. Death can be painful and it can be sudden. So while you're living as a person of faith, you're always thinking about your dying. And when you're dying, you are thinking about your living because you are thinking about your next life. And that changes your orientation to reality profoundly, in my view. And you may say, but actually, does it change people's practical actions? Because it's an era of outstanding villainy as well as great goodness. But I think it does, because I think even the greatest sinners have a sense of sin. They have a sense of retribution coming down the road. It's a great difference between them and us. And I was determined not to downplay this factor because it was so vital in Thomas Cromwell's life. This is the man who was under the king in charge of the church in England. His own faith, as I know you agree, Dermot, was profoundly important to him. And so, it may be that certain readers come to the book and they think, oh, it's Robert Barnes, or, oh, it's John Lambert. I don't want to know about them. I want to get on to a wife. But I'm going to give you the whole picture, the theology as well as the politics, and hope that the thing is to remember it in every line. So, when my characters speak of something that happens in a short space of time, then it's in the space of an Ave. Church bells are an incessant soundtrack. When they get angry, they don't use sexual swear words, they blaspheme. And I want their faith to penetrate them in all ways as characters. Whether I succeeded in drawing the reader into that world, it's not really for me to say, but I know it was really important for me to try.
One of the things that you've sort of suggested there is that a way of drawing readers in, drawing yourself in the writing, is very subtle. There are subtle things like making sure, for example, they use the correct kind of cursing language, making sure that there is a network of realism that we may not as readers think, aha, she's got that just right, because in many cases, how would we know? But I know it was also something to do with all the symbolism and patterning that you used, the imagery that you used, maintaining that across 3 books. When you reach the end of the trilogy, just tell us how that worked. That idea that I think you said when I interviewed you before, all the arrows that you shot had to land somewhere.
That's an act of faith as well. It's an act of faith, I suppose, almost in the subconscious of the writer and the subconscious of the book. Because I became so aware of how many layers a narrative works on. Nobody's clever enough to control it all, to target all those arrows precisely. So what I would be doing, involved in one of these big complex chapters of The Mirror and the Light particularly, I would be trusting, I would be keeping my attention on the scene that I was writing, as if I were there in the room. And I would be saying, I hope that the organisation of this chapter is taking care of itself. And only when I got to the end of the chapter and then move away, get a little distance on it, I could then look back and see its shape. I did impose a structure by dividing each section into three. So first, middle and final act of each part of the story. And that helped, but actually in a novel, it's only in genre that you can impose a structure. In the kind of novel that a reader is going to be able to read twice, structure is found rather than imposed, because it's something that has to seem natural and organic, and it has to work on several different levels. So my hope was always that the reader's subconscious was matching mine, so that the reader isn't saying, there's that motif again. The reader is feeling it almost on a vibratory level. That this is the deepest, almost the buried layer of the book. I'm not conscious of putting the stuff there, and yet the reader is registering it in some way, I hope.
At the more sort of overt levels of the book, you mentioned villainy. You mentioned the thought that, readers might be thinking, give me a wife, let's get on to a wife. Of course, we have such a sort of formed opinion of the Tudors and of Cromwell. Your own relations, I know, with Wolsey, with Cromwell, became very, very deep, didn't they? And it's often been said that, you have really changed our view of Thomas Cromwell. How much were you aware of that changing and deepening as you went through the trilogy?
Well, I think we should give Dermot McCullough a lot of credit for changing our view of Thomas Cromwell as well, because he's the one who's provided the scholarly work. He wasn't working on these books when I began the novels. Imagine how much easier my life would have been if he had. So I was walking in the dark a little bit with my version of Thomas Cromwell, finding my way to him, really. To me, none of these people are dead. They're just like my friends and relatives. And I have a really strong sense of each of them, not so much a visual sense, but of them as energies. And what's fascinating? When I began the project, of course, I thought to myself, well, all those shelves and shelves full of novels about Henry VIII and his wives, is that a negative or a positive? And I decided it was a positive because it meant that to all of us, some of the personnel of that court are still works in progress. And we gossip about them as if they were our friends, people we knew. The story is not dead. So I decided not to be intimidated by the books on those shelves, but just to work through again and not, just try to listen to the people and try to look at the evidence afresh, build my characters from scratch, rather than taking them from stained glass windows or portraits.
It's something that really interestingly takes us to our next question from another novelist, Sarah Waters, because she alights on this fact of the dead and the Gothic. I think we're going to have another question now.
Hello, Hilary. Sarah Waters here, huge fan of your books. And my question is about the Gothic, because I've often talked about your books, your earlier books in particular, but the Wolf Hall Trilogy as well. I've often talked about them in a way that places them in a kind of Gothic literary tradition, which is a tradition, of course, that going back to the days of Mary Shelley and beyond has often featured brilliant women writers like yourself. So what I'd like to know first is, do you have any thoughts on why the Gothic has proved so appealing to women writers over the years? But also, do you consider yourself a Gothic writer? Do you feel part of a Gothic literary tradition? Is it at all a useful way of talking about your books, do you think? I have a feeling that you're wary of literary labels and that you might say no to that, but I'm curious.
Hilary, just before you start to answer, I think some people have had a little bit of trouble with the video, so I'm just going to reprise what Sarah said, which was to ask, she's felt that your work sometimes could be located in the Gothic tradition, a tradition that often features brilliant women writers, as she says, like yourself. Do you wonder yourself why it's been had such an affinity with women writers, and do you see yourself in a Gothic tradition?
Partly. I don't think the trilogy, for me, belongs in the Gothic tradition because it's quintessentially a feminine form and must centre on a woman figure. I have written a novel called 8 Months on Gaza Street early in my career, set in modern-day Saudi Arabia, which, after I had written it, I understood to be perfectly within the Gothic genre, despite its setting, its modernity, because you have the situation of a woman, she's far from home and kin, she's in an environment where she's trapped and confined, doesn't understand the rules apparently keep changing. She begins to distrust the people about her, particularly the men. There's an air of menace and oppression. Things are happening in the next room to which she has no access. And crucially, people cause her to doubt her own grip on reality and suggest that it would be better if she took some tranquilizers. And actually, she is hanging on to her belief, her desire to find the truth, however she is imperiled. And to me, all that is the essence of the Gothic form. So I think I have explored it. And if you think how alive it is, you think of those princesses whom we suppose now to be trapped in Dubai. We're living through the Gothic every day. I feel that the trilogy can't be confined in that way. And I think it's important for me that it centres on a masculine figure who really has agency in his world, really has power, and is only actually confined at the very end of the book, of the trilogy.
I know that something... I think that's something we might come back to is the very end of the trilogy, which is something that so many readers said they could hardly bear to finish it. They were so immersed and knew so well what was coming that they could hardly bear to finish it. But thinking about that idea of Cromwell as a figure of agency, of course, you went right back to his beginning when, there had to be a lot of imagining because we didn't know very much about him before he was a public figure. Throughout the trilogy, there is so much about class and hierarchy and its intersection with the court, isn't there? I just wonder how important that was to you to bring out.
Well, it's class in a rather different sense from the class system we live in. It is an intensely hierarchical world. And Cromwell's family were not the bottom of the heap. They weren't, well, he says in the book, my family weren't poor, they were just disorderly. His father is a hustling, bustling local businessman, the kind of neighbourhood bully with a finger in every pie. We don't know anything about his formal education, and it seems that he got out of the country and went to France still in his mid-teens, came back a European, a cosmopolitan figure, very different from most of the men at Henry's court. And this is a crucial thing about Cromwell, the way he made his way through the hierarchy. He didn't join the church. For a commoner, that was the route to power. Wolsey, for example, once he was a cardinal, had status with kings. Didn't matter where he began. But Cromwell didn't go into the church. It was as if he looked at the institutions of state and he brought along his own ladder and started climbing. And he redefined those institutions around him. The way he shaped his career, the way he used the existing power structure was extremely clever. And it makes him very different, for example, from my French revolutionaries, who have to overthrow the system to get power. Cromwell works from the inside.
And he basically, I think the phrase you've used previously, he rises without trace, doesn't he? But one has this sense, this arc of the story, of course, that we know is that if you rise, you will fall. Having to follow that arc over 3 books, having to follow the historical record in that way, how was that for you? How did that feel?
Oh, strengthening. Absolutely encouraging. I've no wish to, no wish to readjust the shape of that. The task is to find the drama within that. And it's a very steep rising curve and a very sudden fall, because as Cromwell was arrested in high summer, but it was only that spring, the spring of 1540, that the king had promoted him within the court hierarchy and also made him Earl of Essex. In March, I would say, he thought he was down and out. In April, he's an earl. In June, he's in the Tower. So the drama is done for you, if you like. What you have to do is get in there and find the why. And also, you know, as I've said before, the crucial question of how did all that feel? And did he think there was a way out? A way back?
Do you think you did find the why? And do you think he did think there was? No, you didn't. You didn't. Tell us why.
The wonderful thing is that he was as enigmatic on the last page as on the first. I knew a lot about him. I had imagined a lot about him, and I had learned a lot about him from the record. But I still felt this is a man who never explains himself. You can feel your way into such a character, but you can never be certain. There's also, you know, an ambiguity surrounding everything he does and says. And he was a great friend of Thomas Wyatt, the poet, the most ambiguous of poets, and an accomplished diplomat, a man who would lie abroad for his country. And I would have loved to have heard a conversation between Thomas Wyatt and Thomas Cromwell. simply for the dodging and the equivocations and the double meanings that would infuse every line. Wyatt was the last person on this earth he spoke to, bar the executioner, if the accounts we have are correct. And beneath all that politics, beneath all the cunning, the manoeuvring, the manipulation, there is the poetry. That means you will never really add it up.
Hilary, I mentioned a few minutes ago that people have described just feeling distraught as they approach the end of the trilogy and the end of Thomas Cromwell. I wonder how you felt as you got towards the end and how you feel about that now.
Well, I'll be very honest with you and say that I wrote the end while I was in the early stages of Wolf Hall. So, bearing in mind, I didn't know at that time that there would be a 15-year process and that it would be a trilogy. And I thought I was going to bring it all in within one book. But I thought I have to have some idea of how I want the reader to feel at the end. What kind of atmosphere do I want to create here? And it came to me, how those final paragraphs must be, what the final feeling must be of knowing you were going to die, knowing you were dying, perhaps seeing your own blood and feeling life ebbing within you. Now, I lived through all this in Sainsbury's because I just got my trolley to the checkout when the whole thing arrived inside me, as one might say. The feeling of the River Thames, of being pulled away on the tide. And so I continued putting my groceries through, and I cried on my groceries on my hands, and I cried very hard, and I threw everything into the basket. Luckily, I have a husband who has presence of mind, so he remembered to pay, and we went home and I wrote it down. And it isn't, quite what an author would choose. It doesn't live up to the legend of an author's romantic process. But so it was. And then I got it. So I filed it away. And then when it came to the last couple of days' work, I had a kind of security because I thought, well, I don't know the exact arrangement of sentences yet, but I do know where we're going with this. Otherwise, I think it would have just devastated me. I would have approached it with that feeling of dread, whereas in fact, I approached it, I'm afraid, rather consciously and pragmatically, and with a feeling that it was going to be under control. And I left myself 2 hours work to do for the final day. So I left Cromwell more or less on the scaffold and then went back next day and I finished him off. And
Wow.
Then I thought, well, goodness, what is it? It's barely noon. I can't stop work now. Better do a bit of editing. So I started again.
But Hilary, I mean, actually, a lot of people, and perhaps this is why 99 point whatever percent of us don't write these extraordinary things, would have stopped at that point and thought it's time for champagne or equivalent treat. You have talked a lot over the years about the factory nature of making this, about the intense work procedures. there's no point where you kind of say that is enough now. That's enough. It's an afternoon off for me.
There are bad days, and anyone who writes is familiar with this, I think. There are days when you wake up, you pluck the images out of your dreams, the words are running already, you're really on song. And then there are other days when it's like, when they tried to send the cannon north to combat the pilgrims in the pilgrimage of grace, the autumn of 1536, and the cannons all got stuck in the mud, and I think they got as far as Enfield, and the roads were impassable and the weather was closing in, and sometimes that's how you feel as a writer. Or to choose a more homely example, it's like trying to pick something out of treacle. And yet, you can still go on. There are bad writing days, but you always can write. You can always do something. And of course, with a project like this, there's always reading, sorting and filing to do. There's always checking and editing. And so if you feel, well, I'm not quite hitting it today, you simply move to another part. A little soothing card indexing, back on track.
Hilary, we have a question from another novelist now, one, like Sarah too, whose work ethic is right up there with yours, I think. It's Margaret Atwood.
Hello, Hilary. Lovely to see you, although I'm not seeing you. And my question for you is, in the Cromwell trilogy, how did you research the clothing?
How did you research the clothing? That's a brilliant question, isn't it?
It starts with the body. It starts with the skin. The important thing is, I think, that you as a writer, you feel those clothes on your back. And clothes are really important because they define who you are. They define status, they define income, and your place in the hierarchy. So imagine it, from the skin outwards. The higher you rise in income, the more you're at ease because the finer your linen gets. So it's important to unweave the clothes, go back and learn about textiles. And then I always want to know how things are put together. And, there are these people who do historical reenactments. And people laugh at them, but they shouldn't really. They're so dedicated. And they go off every summer to Tudor camp. And they turn up with their hand-sewn clothes and their handmade shoes. And if you get it wrong, if you've cheated and put a zip in, you get sent home. So these people put a lot of stuff online. And, you can get pattern books, you can see them constructing things. And, you can imagine yourself inside them. You're building them from the inside out. Also, I think, working in the theatre and with TV production helped me. I didn't spend a lot of time on set, but my happiest time was in the trailer with the costumes. And it makes you quickly realise certain things. You know how in Tudor portraits of women, they always have their hands at around waist height and usually clasped. And put your hand into one of those sleeves, and what you realise immediately is no other posture is really possible, because if you don't hold your sleeves up, you've got to balance the weight. And your sleeves are going to be on the ground if you don't bring your hands to waist height. So the women always look as if they're holding themselves together or indicating their insides, their fertility, but at the same time protecting themselves. Maybe that's what they really were thinking. And you're not held together in the way a modern person is. You're held together by loops and buttons, by pins. You might even be sewn into your clothes at some point, and by ties, little linen tags and silk ties. All of these things are important when you consider the effect of clothes on the body inside them. I'm not a dressmaker, but I have enough idea to know how clothes are built. And so that's how I thought about it.
Thank you so much. That's really fascinating. And of course, it goes right to the heart of so much that you've thought about and written about the body. I just want to, before we take some questions from the audience, to ask you about that relationship with other things that you've written. I'm thinking about your memoir, Giving Up the Ghost, about the diary that you wrote of your own time in hospital, Ink in the Blood, about books like Beyond Black, where the dead are so with us and so physical. This is really important to you, isn't it? This sort of visceral sense of how we are physically, as much as what's going on inside our minds and hearts.
Yes. I know no way to write except to move inside my character's body temporarily. And this takes some neat footwork at times because you have to move, you have to be nimble. 1 minute you're inside Anne Boleyn's little narrow body, and the next minute you're the king. You need to have a sense of their weight of mass. And I write a lot in the 3 books about Thomas Cromwell's body as we see it in Holbein's portrait, and I describe it as a stocky, useful labourer's body. It's never going to fool anybody. Dress him as you please. He's never going to look like people's idea of an aristocrat. But that burly, solid presence is something he learns to use to his advantage. And I would say that particularly in the last book, what's important is the king's body, his loss of virility, his loss of the sense of himself and who he is. As for all of us, it's very much predicated on his relationship with his body. And as he loses his prowess as a sportsman, as an athlete, and he gains weight and he loses his shape, and he's in pain every day, and it's eroding his personality. And I think you can't really shape your characters convincingly unless you can live skin close with them and try to share that inner experience. And okay, you use the bad parts of things that have happened to you, and you say, all right, this is my resource, this is just another well I draw from.
We're going to take some questions from the audience now, and I'm going to start with a question from Isabel, who asks, what was the inspiration for Kristoff, the fictional character that stood out the most for her? His last line in the book is extraordinary, and just to slightly broaden that out, you've talked about, your cast of, as it were, minor characters and how important it was for them all to be there and have their moments. What about Kristoff?
Kristoff is one of the few imaginary characters. And he came along partway through Wolf Hall when Thomas Cromwell was in Calais. And he goes to a back straight inn to meet some alchemists in the hope of obtaining some secrets for the king. And Kristoff is the waiter. And he's dirty, bedraggled, raw and young. And he wants to leave his present life. And Cromwell looks at him and he thinks, well, that's me. That's what I was like. So he takes Kristoff back with him. The advantage it gave me to have that one imaginary character was that Kristoff was going to accompany him in his final moments. So he can actually speak without registering Kristoff as being there in the room. And he functions rather like Cromwell's id, as it were, because Kristoff is never civilised, he's never repressed. He's always the one who says the things that nobody else will say. It's really valuable to have a character like that in a room. But, and this is the way it works, you think, I'm inventing this character, I just completely made him up. And then I'm reading George Cavendish's life of Cardinal Woolsey, which is a near contemporary document, one of the first biographies in English. So Cavendish tells about Wolsey's trip to France in the late 1520s, when, as every potentate did, he took his own gold and silver plate with him, set it up in his residence to impress the French. Now it happened that a great thief had identified the Cardinal as the target, and a little boy was going up and down stairs, stealing the gold and silver piece by piece, so young and so inconsiderable that no one ever noticed him. And when I read about that little boy, I thought, it's Kristoff. And Cromwell, in the book, then I worked along with this idea. Cromwell doesn't realise that Kristoff ever met the Cardinal until he emerges almost incidentally one day, and he says, well, yeah, I was the little boy who robbed him. And I was sorry I ever did so, because he was kind to me and gave me apricots, which before I had never tasted. But he says, in those days my name was Fabrice, and it's another life. And so then to me, Kristoff, whom I thought I had invented, became this sort of semi-real character who is never named. And that's the way, I think, you learn to burrow into the historical record and you pull out a plum. That's what Kristoff was. He was a plum.
Thank you very much. Mike Watkinson asked a question about Wolsey and about Cromwell here. He says, you show Cromwell's as driven by a desire to avenge Wolsey's downfall. Do you think there was any way he could have avoided Wolsey's fate for himself?
I think he probably always had Wolsey's fate in mind. I think, though, there's more to it than revenge. You see, I became very conscious looking at the historical record. I look at Cromwell's policies and I think, actually, this is not new, this is quite old. This goes back to the Cardinal. And I became aware that there's a line there that, as if there's something that Cromwell alone is carrying and continuing from the Cardinal. And in that way, I think Wolsey was a positive influence in his life. And I became conscious that he never forgot the Cardinal. There's record of a terrible row he had with the Duke of Norfolk, which I reproduce in somewhat altered form quite late in the book, and we're talking now about 1539. It's as if the Cardinal comes and talks to him in the silence of the night. That's precisely what happens in my book. Could he have avoided it? I think there was always going to be a crash. The factors stacked against him, were too great. Leaving out circumstance and adverse circumstance, which is everything in politics, even the structural factors, because Cromwell wasn't like the aristocratic courtiers. He had no faction backing him, except what he made himself. He had no great family. He had no natural supporters. He had no great affinity. It was all about his relationship with Henry. And when that soured, then I think it was pretty well inevitable. However, you see, nothing's predetermined. It happened a certain way, but it could have happened other ways. If he could have got to Henry, he would have been, if he could have made personal contact with him, Henry, his mind could be changed easily. He was an emotional man. And then Cromwell would have been the one who successfully retired with his gains, went off to live in one of his abbeys and grew honoured in age. Doesn't seem likely, though, does it? There was one courtier, Sir Henry Guildford, very prominent courtier, driven out by the Boleyn faction. Couldn't stand Anne Boleyn, so he said to Henry, "I'm quitting." He went off in a huff. And people in my book, as I'm sure in life, they talk about Henry Guildford. He went back to the country. He died of boredom. Because what's it all about except the court and the king? And an honourable retirement wasn't an option for many people.
There is that interesting thought that you've obviously given voice to there, that actually when you're writing about history, you write to what has happened, but something else could have happened. Sort of relatedly, there's a question from Anne, and she says she's read a lot of novels where the novelist has obviously done huge amounts of research and then feel they need to include it all, and you haven't done that. But how strong is the temptation to, and how do you filter it?
Yes, it's a good question, because you're all the time guessing how much knowledge the reader brings to it, which is very different from one reader to the next. And, you have to bear in mind an international audience as well. So you're guessing how much do I need to tell the reader? And you're all the time as well running an information check. I said this on page 37. I'm now on page 437. Do I need to say it again? That's common to every writer in every novel, controlling the information flow. I think you have to be aware that when in a historical novel, when you have two characters on the page, they're speaking to each other, each of them has a huge amount of implicit knowledge. They're not going to be explaining to each other the basics of the situation each and every day. Things are noticed. When a newcomer arrives, someone new to the cast, he can be told things. When someone upsets the balance, new information can be given. When things change in the external world, then you want the reader to see it. And I think it's on a need-to-know basis, and locating your information as an active principle. So it doesn't weigh down the text. It acts like yeast. It actually peps up the narrative as it goes. So yes, the hardest thing is deciding what do we need and let everything else fall away. But I think I'm never afraid to allude, to let the characters allude naturally to people they know, things that have happened, without feeling the reader requires a full explanation. Sometimes you would like to put a star at the side of the page and say, see my other novel on this point. You know, an unwritten novel, the one about Thomas Wyatt, the one about Mary Tudor. This whole thing could proliferate and become a life's work. Somewhere though, you've got to stop. And, you know, I think 15 years was probably it.
There's another question here from Richard about decision making, and this one's about how you choose the titles of the books, because you know there are obviously so many significant fragments you could have chosen from. How did they all come about?
Wolf Hall was there right from the start. Never had any hesitation about what to call it. It just seemed to me to sum up the situation. Everywhere Henry moves is Wolf Hall. And then I thought, you know, some people have said, actually, you don't mention Wolf Hall to the last page. And that's not true. Little mentions of it are seeded throughout the first novel. But I made up my mind that Wolf Hall would be the very last words. And so I made that happen. And the vividness and the symbolic weight of that was just too much to resist. Bring Up the Bodies was different. The title didn't emerge until I wrote those words into the text, because I'm talking about you have Anne Boleyn's supposed lovers arrested, shut in the tower, and the order goes out to produce them for trial. And in English, one may translate this as bring up the bodies for trial. And as soon as I wrote those words, I thought, that's a title, and this is a book. And I knew that the second book must end with the death of Anne Boleyn. And The Mirror and the Light was a very different process. It's actually a phrase used by Cromwell himself, which I quote in a letter. He called Henry the mirror and the light of other kings. And he was writing to Thomas Wyatt. But I saw the mirror and the light, as it were. One evening I was in East Sussex, near Lewes, a place very important in Cromwell's life. It was evening, we were going over the downs, and there was the most extraordinary silver sky with a ball of fiery red sun. And the whole thing had an unearthly beauty. It seemed to be pulled straight out of time. And I thought, that is the mirror and the light. And that's the title. So they all arrived by a very different process.
Hilary, we have a few minutes left, sadly, but I'm going to ask a final question from the audience. This is from Susan, but actually it's been echoed in lots of questions. She asks, to what extent do you consider that your trilogy has been successful in presenting this adroit and increasingly human Cromwell to the world, by comparison with a general historical view that he was, in quotes, a very bad man?
Yes, that very bad man, that's what I started with. But I began to perceive how the record was doubling back and reduplicating itself. Little packages of nonsense were being kicked down the years from one historian to another, without anyone getting in there and saying, stop, let's have another look at the record. And let's read it through a different prism. Let's start again with this man and speak as we find. I think the perception of Cromwell as a double-dyed villain was very much something that had come to us through popular history, fiction, drama. There was another Cromwell in scholarship, a clever devil, a refined intellect, a man who was very central to Henry's reign. But as some readers will know, it was Geoffrey Elton who was so central to Cromwell's studies and to redefining his place in English history. A generation back, Elton despised biography. What Dermot McCullough has now done is give us this living, breathing man, embedded that portrait of Cromwell in a scholarly context and revisited the record, wiped it clean, as it were, and rebuilt. What I've tried to do in a novel form, imaginatively, here's done working through the scholarly record. Our perception of Cromwell has changed forever, I hope. But it's a lesson. It's not just about Thomas Cromwell. It's about how can we roll these bundles of prejudice down the years? Who cries stop and let's reevaluate? I perceive it as a process of trying to do justice. Not, as I've said before, I'm not his parole officer. I'm not in charge of his rehabilitation. But I want to scramble through the thicket to some kind of truth that may be hidden there at the centre. And it is, in some ways, about doing justice not just to Cromwell, but to the process of historical inquiry. But, of course, justice is never finally done. It's all process.
Hilary, thank you so much. I have a final question of my own. When we spoke sort of over a year ago, you said that you wouldn't be embarking on a kind of comparable epic project, and I think the phrase you used was "it's simple maths," which is delightfully unsentimental way of referring to the passage of time. But you also said you have been over the years kind of filing away ideas, and you could, if you had stamina and energy and time, pull them out of a hat almost like a magician's rabbit. What is next? And I'm not asking you to be specific about something that you're working on, but the general view.
I have a new novel on the go. It's a bit too delicate to be breathed on as yet. I simply don't know whether it will work or not at this stage. In the last year, I have to say there are certain projects that have fallen away. It's been a time of regrouping and rethinking, and I've come to the conclusion that there are certain novels I should let go. It may be I haven't solved their technical difficulties, or maybe the project has just gone off the boil. Just as you have to be ready to write the novel, you can also overshoot, you can go past it. So I'm trying to let those things go and maybe write another play. I don't know, depending how things go with the adaptation. I'd like some time to concentrate on short stories because I have a file of unfinished short stories. And they're all mini novels, you know, they require the same effort of concentration. So I've got lots to keep me going, but I haven't got another Thomas Cromwell waiting in the wings, as it were. I don't feel that there is unfinished business in that regard. I feel that the trilogy, as we said earlier, is what I was working towards through my life. And I'm not ready for the final curtain, but it is a distinct phase. And 2 or 3 years' time, Thomas Cromwell and I hope, will be able to bow to each other and we will both move on. He into eternity, and me, hopefully, with a little more time.
I will ask you a sort of cheeky rider to that, though. Thomas Cromwell, perhaps, but you have mentioned Thomas Wyatt a couple of times, and I wonder if you're feeling a bit preoccupied by him and whether he might be unfinished business.
No more Tudor novels.
Okay.
No, I think I take the view that if I couldn't do it in the trilogy, I can't do it. And you know, it's no bad thing to have areas of mystery remaining. You always want to feel in your life, as in your work, that there are doors you could open. There are curtains you could peep behind. In a way, you want never to have finished and for projects to remain in potential. But what I don't have is regrets. There are, I should say, in the play, in the adaptation, there are some scenes that don't take place in the book. So perhaps that answers the question in a way. There was a little more to be done. And it's about exploiting the possibilities of a different form. So I cannot really imagine getting to the end of work, but what I can imagine, and I must imagine, is getting to the end of my career. I am, as you said, I'm very driven. I have to put in my long working day, and there will come a time when I want to sit and look at the sea, I think. And what's not been done will have to remain forever in potential. This sounds very valedictory. I don't mean to be depressing, you know. It's exhilarating rather than depressing.
I took it that way, and I think our audience would. I never find it depressing to talk to you about these things, Hilary. I always come away feeling exhilarated, having read and talked and listened to you. I think we are hoping that the play might come to fruition towards the end of this year, but of course, as we know, everything is still up in the air, and we hope the picture book will be something that we can also set our eyes on fairly soon. But in the meantime, I think that our out there audience, and if there's one thing we do know about the past year, it's meant that moving these events online has meant that we can welcome people from so many different places and people who might not be physically able to come to a live event. So thank you all so much for joining us. But I think we all have to thank you very much for keeping us entertained throughout your career, but in fine Tudor style over the last several years. Thank you so much for talking to us this evening. Thank you out there for joining us too. Do check with the Guardian website. We've got more events coming up. Douglas Stewart, for example, and a June celebration of the Guardian. But my immense thanks to Hilary Mantel and to you. Thank you and good evening.
Good evening.